It's a pleasure to be back here. This is my second opportunity to speak here at the museum. So it's great to be back, and I appreciate being invited back. And I'm particularly happy and gratified to get to talk to you on this topic today. As you heard, this lecture grows out of work that I'm doing at the moment, finishing a master's thesis in a master's in military history at the Citadel. I actually have a few of my classmates are kind enough to come here and have all agreed to heckle me during the presentation. So if you see rotten eggs or hear any, Bronx cheers coming from the crowd, those are my classmates. And my topic, not surprisingly, is on Maurice Rose, Major General Maurice Rose, and looking at both his life and career. So what I'm going to speak to you today about his contributions at the Battle of the Bulge grow out of this larger research project that I've been hard at work at for a year, up to my eyeballs and then some in. And you'll be the beneficiary of part of that in that some of the materials you're going to see today are from different archives that house material on him and the division that he commanded, so aren't out there in the public domain. So hopefully that's a little bit of a special treat, as it were, for all of you. And again, I think Rose is a fascinating character, and he plays a very important and very unique role in terms of what he does on the battlefield during the Bulge, one that I think is a bit underappreciated. And again, as you heard from the lecture before, I think there's a lot of unsung heroes at the Battle of the Bulge. I think he's one of them. And at the same time, I think he's one of the more important, but today largely overlooked or forgotten commanders overall in World War II, senior commanders. And I think there's a number of reasons for that. Probably the biggest reason is he's killed in combat on March 30th, 1945. He's in the lead of the 3rd Armored Division, the division he commands, as it's the lead division of the spearhead of the American attack in Germany. So he's the highest ranking American commander killed in combat, in actual combat, in Western Europe. But because of that, he leaves no memoirs. He's not there to do interviews after the war. He's not a guy who was prone to doing a lot of writing even before that. So again, I think because of that, he's a bit overlooked or a bit forgotten overall in the history of the war. And that being said, I think he's very militarily important, and I don't think you need to take my word for it. I think a better person to just sort of attest to his overall importance was his boss, who was General Lightning Joe Collins of 7 Corps, so he's in the middle there. And again, I'm going to try to point stuff out on the map. Hopefully, if I won't lose you on the mic in the meantime. So Collins gave a speech after he was promoted in May of 1945 as he was leaving 7 Corps. That's Rose on the far right there, Collins in the middle, and Collins' boss, Ernie Harmon, on the left. And Collins gave a speech in May of 45, a farewell to the 7 Corps. So he's not talking specifically about Rose, but he brings him up in his comments, and he says the following about him. Quote, "I regarded him," meaning Rose, "as the top divisional commander in the business. In my judgment, he more than any other man in the world deserves credit for bringing the war to a conclusion at least 5 or 6 months sooner than it would have been otherwise," unquote. So no small praise. And again, if that doesn't sort of get your attention or convince you of his importance, I think this definitely will, which is that if you don't have Maurice Rose, then HBO's Band of Brothers is 2.5 episodes long. If you remember in episode 3 in Carrington, the Band of Brothers Easy Company is surrounded, about to be overrun by German troops. This is shortly after the D-Day landings. And over the hill come a squadron of tanks to rescue them. You hear one of the officers, I think it's Nixon, says, "Hello, 2nd Armored." So that's the 2nd Armored Division Combat Command A, which is commanded by Maurice Rose. And as we'll talk a bit more about, he's someone who commanded from the front. So General Rose saves the Band of Brothers and makes for a much more interesting and full-fledged HBO Brand of Brothers miniseries. So without him, it's 2.5 episodes and ends on a pretty disappointing note as they get overrun here in Carrington. So to understand what Rose does at the Bulge and why it's so unique, I think you need to step back a bit and understand more about how he first ends up in the combat position, command position that he's in during the Bulge, and his whole approach to combat, which is very iconoclastic, very unique, particularly among divisional commanders at the time. And he's got a very interesting history, which we won't spend a lot of time on, but he's career Army, before beginning in World War I. He volunteers in 1917 as a private, enlists. He's 16 years old in this photo. He's lied about his age. Big guy, he was about 6'2", 6'3". He looked a lot older than his age. So he's 16 years old in this photo, volunteers. He's actually already ran away from home once at age 15 and enlisted in the National Guard, again lying about his age. So he's actually been in the military even before this. They kicked him out after they figured out how old he was, but gave him an honorable discharge, interesting enough, because he had done so well. So he's 16 years old, joins the Army, ends up an officer in World War I. He's wounded twice, decorated, stays with the Army after the war, and in the interwar Army ends up in the cavalry in 1930. Now, the American cavalry is not exactly state-of-the-art in the 1930s. So this is Rose on maneuvers in the Panama Canal Zone, which obviously is back in the news these days, but this is what the US Army was using on maneuvers in 1934. But Rose falls in with a vanguard, a few folks you've heard of like Eisenhower and Patton, who are advocates within the cavalry and within the Army at large for the potential for tanks, for armored mechanized units to really be the future of mobile ground warfare. At the time, they're considered very much dismissed, if you will, by the establishment within the Army and within the cavalry. But Rose ends up, by 1941, by the outbreak of war for America with Pearl Harbor, as a battalion commander in the sole armored unit that the American Army has recently put together, and that's really in the wake of the German Blitzkrieg, demonstrating they were clearly way, way behind on technology. So when Pearl Harbor happens, when the war breaks out, any commander that's got expertise in tank warfare in the Army is now desperately in need. And as a general proposition, their stock rises very quickly. Rose is one of them. He ends up as first Chief of Staff and then head of what's called Combat Command A. That was the group that saves the Band of Brothers that I just showed you a few minutes ago, of the 2nd Armored Division. That is the division that Patton famously nicknamed the Hell on Wheels Division. Rose did a lot to help it live up to its nickname. So this is Rose getting his colonel bars, and that's Patton on the left there, his ultimate boss. So Rose is someone who gets thrust up into senior command very quickly. And he fights in North Africa, actually with the 1st and the 2nd Armored. He fights with Combat Command A again, of the 2nd Armored in Sicily. He fights again at D-Day and the Allied breakout with Combat Command A of the 2nd Armored Command. His success there and Omar Bradley's frustrations with Leroy Watson, who is then the commander of the 3rd Infantry Division, lead Bradley in August of 1944 to fire Watson and put Rose in as commander of the 3rd Armored Division. And his mission, Bradley tells him to light a fire under the division. And he's picked the right man to do that. Rose wastes very little time. He's been very successful in helping lead the Allied breakout with the 2nd. He then continues that with the 3rd, and this is Rose after he's been promoted to the head of the 3rd Armored. So there he is with Collins and with Bradley. So you've got 4 stars, 3 stars, 2 stars, so a lot of stars in that photo. But He's, again, a very hard-charging personality, a very hard-charging general. He nicknames the 3rd Division the Spearhead. It doesn't have a nickname before that. And again, very much sets out to make sure it lives up to its nickname. And there's some nice, really interesting history here at the museum that relates to that. So if you look here, this is a jacket from the 3rd Armored. You can see that it does not have the spearhead patch underneath it, which means obviously the Army did not run around as soon as a general announced a new nickname for division and change already patches that exact day. But in all likelihood, this predates Rose taking over the 3rd Division. This helmet, which is part of the museum's collection, here has a spearhead sticker on it. You did not want to be this private. Who? But separate question. He lived, so. But that has a spearhead sticker on it. That means you know that that's from after Rose took over the division. And if you look in the display cases in the museum that have every division's uniform, you'll see that the shoulder patch has the spearhead underneath it. So that's one you know is from someone who was in Rose's division in the 3rd after Rose takes over the division. So in moving to the Bulge, you got a good, in the lecture before, overview of the kind of broad strategic picture, but it's important just to touch on it again briefly because it very much impacts Rose's contribution and Rose's role in the Battle of the Bulge. And again, the important thing looking at the 100,000-foot perspective on the Battle of the Bulge is, as you heard in the prior lecture very well articulated, the goal is Antwerp. The goal is to cut the British and American forces at Antwerp. The main thrust of that attack, the main strategic thrust of the attack, is the middle of 3 branches. So you have a northern shoulder or northern thrust to the strategic plan by the Germans. That's up at the top there, the 15th and 6th. You then have the 6th and 5th coming in the middle, and then a southern thrust that goes through Bastogne. But again, the main strategic thrust, the direct line to Antwerp, which is the goal of this operation, is the middle prong. So it's important to bear in mind that as much as Bastogne and the southern prong eventually really does become very strategic and very important, this is where, particularly in the initial days of the Bulge, if you look in the period from, say, the 16th to Christmas, this is the strategic aim, the goal, and the main strategic thrust of the German attack. Now, to give you again a high-level sense, why is Rose and the 3rd Armored Division important in all this? That's where they end up. So again, they are in the path, if you will, of the main strategic thrust of the German army in the Battle of the Bulge. Now, there's a basic problem with, I think, every map, probably of every World War II battle, but definitely the Battle of the Bulge, which is you have 2 choices. One is the map before, which is not complicated enough, or this kind of map, which is too complicated. So what happens? The battle starts on the 16th. This is the situation on the 20th, and this map actually takes you through to the 25th, so that's part of the confusion. What's happened by the 20th, I did my best in a low-tech way to sort of block it out. It's these darker lines are the German positions as of December 20th. And in a lot of ways, the battle has, in some senses, shaped up as the Germans designed it. There are 3 really prongs to this attack. And what that's created is really 3, in a sense, hinge points that the battle now really hinges on. One is up in the north along, if you can see up there, and you have a map that's more detailed than this, so you don't have quite this level of detail on it, but is Elsenborn Ridge. And up there is the 99th Infantry Division and the 2nd Infantry Division. And they've been able, by the 20th, not to turn around in any way, but they've been able to slow and blunt the German attack on the north. Bastogne is to your south, and obviously that's become critical as well. And that's, I think, a story that's probably best known to most people who are familiar with the Bulge. But the thrust that hasn't, in a sense, been checked is the main thrust, the middle thrust, which is here. And that's the one that's really succeeded, kind of most handsomely, if you will, in its strategic aim. And the town of Houffalize, which is right here, is a critical crossroads town. The Germans have complete control of it. And again, as you're looking at the history of the Bulge, it's a history of roads. You want to understand why is something important, why is something strategic. Remember, you're in the Ardennes, it's a forest, it's the dead of winter. If you want to move anything that's mechanical, and even if you just want to move on foot, you need a road. So if there isn't a road system, there's no path for the Germans, there's no path for the Americans. So that's why Bastogne becomes so important. It's a literal crossroads. Again, same in the north. Well, Houffalize is another hinge. And like Bastogne, it's a critical crossroads. But it's particularly critical in that if you want to get to Antwerp, if you want to get to Liège, if you want to get to the north and the west, you need those crossroads. So again, I don't want to overstate what American knowledge is on the 20th. Actually, it's quite important to emphasize the Americans still by the 20th don't really know what the German aim is here. And in fact, the intelligence is such that they don't even necessarily know what they're up against in a specific way. But it's shaping up that this center thrust is the one that has, if you're from a German perspective, in a way, the most likelihood of breaking through in the short run. And if it does, it's got the direct route to Antwerp. So on the 19th, Rose's division is ordered in. They do a 100-mile drive, motorized march, to a hastily improvised front that's going to run along that dotted line there. So Rose arrives dead of the night on the 19th with his division overnight and assesses the situation. So again, we're going to zoom in now on that yellow box. And this is the map that I handed out just because this is really the key map. And again, I find it's hard for people to see these on screen sometimes. But if you look in the upper right, that was the map we were looking at before. We've now, in effect, zoomed in on that yellow box. Now, Rose is given a 13-mile segment to defend, again, which is just a gap in the American lines at this point. And his orders are very detailed. His orders are, number one, initiate reconnaissance. Number two, locate the enemy. And three, secure a line. So that's all he's got to work with. The intelligence that he has is precisely zero. And again, big picture, you want to understand the Battle of the Bulge, you have to appreciate and acknowledge it's a massive intelligence failure on the part of the United States. And it's not just a macro level intelligence failure, meaning a failure to anticipate the attack, but once the battle actually starts on a micro level, on a tactical level, particularly over the first 4 or 5 days, it's a complete really breakdown of any intelligence whatsoever. And it's not just intelligence on the German forces, it's actually intelligence on our own forces, on American forces as well. So Rose is given precisely zero intelligence. He has no idea what's coming for him. He has no idea what's in front of him. He has no idea what American forces are in front of him even. All he's been told is, in effect, hold this line, tie in with the 82nd Airborne to his north, so it's Matthew Ridgway commanding up there, and then the 86th Division to his southwest, and hold the line. So that's problem number one. He has no idea what's in front of him or what's coming. But what's clear is, again, crossroads. He can look at the map, and there are very clearly 4 key points here that are going to have to be defended, because these are your major roads, east and west, and north and south. So nobody knows where the Germans are going, but they're clearly heading north and west. And if they want to get north and west, they need these roads. They have to control these roads, and they have to control these crossroads. And you can see on the map that you've got probably the roads a little bit better, but there's 3 major north-south roads running through here, 2 major east-south, east-to-west, highways. So this, again, is a nexus, like Bastogne, one of these meeting places or crossroads that's critical. So first problem is lack of intelligence. This is what's coming at him. He doesn't know it, but there are 3 German divisions headed his way, 2 panzer divisions, German tank divisions, and 1 infantry division. So the 116th Panzer, which is a very experienced German panzer division, the Wolfhound Division is its nickname. The 560th Volksgrenadier, these are young recruits. They've in effect been taken out of school and hastily organized into a division, but they are commanded by their instructors, who are all quite experienced officers. And the 2nd SS Panzer Division, which is a well-known and notorious division, the Das Reich Division. This is a very hardened, very experienced, to put it politically, tactfully, very tough division, rough division. They've come from fighting on the Soviet Union. They've committed more than their share of atrocities there. They've already committed atrocities against civilians here in the Battle of Bulge. Again, they're bringing both an experience and a style that's very much Eastern Front in its mindset. So again, Rose doesn't know this, but he has 3 divisions coming his way. To top it off, in terms of the strategic challenge that he's got to figure out, having driven all night and getting, in effect, dumped here on December 20th, is he doesn't have his entire division. In fact, he's got less than 1/3 of it. And again, this goes back to these intelligence failures. The first 4 or 5 days of the Bulge in particular are heavily improvisational, to sort of put it charitably, in terms of what the United States is doing from a command perspective. So again, the division that he has, a 3rd Armored Division, it's what's called a heavy division. It's got 15,000 men, and it's divided up into 2 combat commands, which are essentially self-contained fighting units. Combat Command A, Combat Command B, and then a reserve. So in the last couple of days, Rose has had both his Combat Command A stripped from him to go try to track down German paratroopers, and Combat Command B has been stripped from him. Combat Command B is going after Pfeiffer, who's a famous German tank commander in the Battle of the Bulge. So Rose is left with less than 5,000 of his troops, and in effect, they're the wrong 5,000. He has no heavy tanks. They're all with his Combat Command A and B. He's got his reserve units, the train unit, meaning the supply and logistics part of his units. He's got the cooks, the engineers, the reconnaissance people. So he doesn't really have a division. He's got, in a sense, you'd say, a regiment, but a regiment that's not even organized as a fighting force. Basically, his total forces are, he has a battalion each of armored infantry. He's got some light tanks, a few medium tanks, some artillery, some combat engineers, a reconnaissance battalion, and that's it. And then his combat command. So again, Rose is faced with a situation where he doesn't know what's coming, but he does, in a sense, have a pretty good idea where it's going to have to be coming from. And his expectation is whatever's coming is coming hard and en masse. The other thing he's very aware of is, with a third of a division, his ability to follow his orders, carry out his orders, are essentially impossible. A full division would normally be responsible for holding about a third of a 13-mile segment. He's got a third of the division to defend 13 miles with 4 strategic points to it. And again, with the troops that he has. So that's the tactical dilemma in front of him. The advantage Rose has is that he is a general who has believed his entire career in commanding from the front. And it's not a euphemism. He is a commander who literally leads from the front. His command post is a Jeep with a radio in it. And so he has been, when he's with the 2nd Armored Division, and with the 3rd in the front, very much immersed, if you will, directly in the battle and directly in the tactical issues of the battle. So unlike most major generals, most 2-star generals, number one, he is very much in the fight. And number two, he's essentially equipped himself to be able to become a regimental commander of his own division, which is in effect what he does here. So Rose looks at this situation, and again, he's an armored commander. These guys have all been taught the mantra of open warfare, of the attack. And Rose looks at this and basically says, this is hopeless. If my job is to hold the line, which is my orders are, we're going to get overrun. So his solution, and again, this I think, to my knowledge, is quite unique, maybe entirely unique within the Battle of Bulge, is I'm attacking first. He takes his men, divides them up into 4 task forces of 400 men each. 3 of them he deploys, 1 down each of these main roads, 1's in reserve. Again, these are stitched together. These are not 400 men that have been designed as a fighting unit. It's, each company has some medium tanks, some self-propelled artillery, a few light tanks, and then reconnaissance troops. Rose's orders are attack. Hit the enemy, whoever the enemy is, wherever they're coming from, before they can hit you. And it's a bet. It's a bluff in a lot of ways by Rose. He's going to send out essentially all the combat troops that he has to attack an enemy of unknown size, also not knowing what American forces may or may not be in the way. But again, he understands, he's been a tank commander who's literally been on the front. He understands, and he's been through this territory this is territory that his division has gone through originally as the Americans are heading to Germany. So he understands the importance of the road network. So in a sense, his orders are to these 4 task force commanders, get out there, engage the enemy wherever you hit them, and then stick there. If you can clog these roads, he figures he's got a chance. He's also betting, in a sense, that whoever he's up against as a commander is going to assume that if he, the German commander, encounters 3 quote-unquote reconnaissance forces of 400 men each with tanks, armor, artillery, that the German commander is going to assume that nobody is dumb enough or audacious enough, shall we say, to send his entire force out on reconnaissance, and that there's got to be a lot more behind it. So that's Rose's bet. He's, again, a believer in the attack. He gives an interview with the New York Times, and he was not a guy who gave interviews, saying something to the effect, this is right before the Battle of Bulge, he said, I think something to the effect of, I cannot imagine a situation in which I would order a retreat. And that's not general talk. I think literally he cannot imagine a situation where he would order a retreat. And even here isn't one where he would even order hold the line. So again, the plan is to attack the Germans before the Germans in effect can attack him. So the 3 task forces are sent out on the 20th. By the 21st or the 22nd, they're all engaged with German forces. And it doesn't go well for these 400 forces. You wouldn't expect it to against the size of enemy forces they're up against. Largely, his tanks are knocked out. Again, they're already under-armored, even our most heavily armored tanks versus the German tanks, but he's only got light and medium tanks. But each of the task forces, is able to engage the enemy before the enemy, in a sense, can engage it and bog down the situation. So what Rose has done is, in effect, taken his confusion or lack of information and flipped it onto the enemy. So the General Kruger, who's in charge of the 116th and essentially the 560th, that Volksgrenadier Division is following his lead, is getting reports up and down the line on the 20th, 21st, 22nd, 23rd of major reconnaissance forces with armor hitting his forces in multiple spots simultaneously. And on top of that, what Rose does is really then conduct kind of a master class in tactical rearrangement of forces. And he will move forces, this force down at the bottom, Task Force Hogan, and I'll come back to Hogan in a little bit, essentially is trapped here, so he can't be redeployed. But these forces still have some mobility left to them. So he's literally shuttling forces between these 2 main hotspots, and also up here, this town of Mahé. In real time, he's in communication with these task force commanders. So he's sliding forces back and forth wherever that point of attack is, that German thrust is. Again, he's trying to quickly counter it and create an impression of force, no matter where the Germans choose to probe. And his strategy is successful. General Kruger, the German general, he's getting reports of strong resistance at Hatten, at this town, that apparently the Americans have a strong presence here on this road, on this road, on this road. And he concludes he must be facing a very powerful force, and he orders the 116th with the 560th behind him to turn west. So Kruger blinks. So that leaves Rose still to deal with the 2nd SS Panzer Division, which is task enough for him and his forces. They don't get reinforced until Christmas Day, until the 25th. But he's at least in a position where he can continue much more sort of effectively to continue this master class in moving pieces on the chessboard to keep the 2nd SS Panzer Division off balance and unable to overrun his positions. So the bluff works, and it works based on his willingness and his instinct to attack, which again is a very unique reaction, particularly in the opening days of the Battle of the Bulge, by I think any commander in any situation like this, but by the American commanders in general. And you heard from the prior speaker that what's, I think, the most interesting and useful and the best way to learn about any of these battles is from the history that was written at the time. And a great resource The American Historical Service, part of the Army's Historical Service, sends in early January historians that are part of the Army to interview up and down the line. So it's from people like Rose well into first lieutenants to interview them in the weeks after the Battle of the Bulge. It's still not even really clear at this point what's happened. So they're trying to understand what happened, how did this occur, what lessons are there to be learned here. So Rose and a number of his subordinates are interviewed by an Army historian in mid-January, and this is what the historian, his name is Fred Hatzel, writes at the time. Quote, "The division succeeded in its mission essentially because it adopted a policy of attacking instead of a passive defense. In a sense, the operation was a bluff, for the enemy had sufficient forces to overrun the division. The policy of attacking even with insufficient strength and against superior numbers permitted the division to hold when other methods would probably have failed," unquote. So again, much more than my judgment or any of the judgments one makes 80, 90 years later, whatever the case may be, I think that's really speaks volumes. And again, it's very unique and very much a credit to Rose and comes out of this whole command philosophy that he brings into the battle here. And I had mentioned before Task Force Hogan, just to flip back. So that's this bottom task force. They're surrounded. And again, I think the other big picture point I'd leave you with in the Battle of the Bulge is, in reality, it's not a battle of senior commanders in a lot of ways. It's very much a battle, and you got a sense from what I was talking about of how improvisational things are. This is very much a battle of mid-level officers, junior officers, and men below that. So again, Task Force Hogan, that's a nice name for it. It's 400 guys that have been thrown together. They haven't fought together. It's not a formal fighting unit. It's Rose taking what he's got, putting it together. So Sam Hogan ends up winning the Silver Star. They fight until they're literally out of fuel, out of bullets, out of tanks, out of everything. Hogan then conducts on foot in the winter a fighting retreat back to Rose's headquarters. And there was an Army photographer there when Hogan got back, and he gets out 399 of his 400 men, which is pretty astounding. But again, he's fought until literally he's got nothing left to fight with. And he succeeded in buying that time and in convincing the German Army that, in fact, he's the front end of a much larger division. So that's Sam Hogan as he's returned, and Maurice Rose says to him something along the lines of, "Well, what took you so long, Hogan?" And he looks over at him, and in probably the only light moment of the whole battle, looks at him and says, "Well, I'm sorry, General, it took me so long, but my feet really hurt." And you can see the photographer captures it over here. Rose, who is not a man that literally anybody can remember smiling, who worked for him, with him, ever, actually smiles and laughs and pats him on the shoulder. And again, I think that's an acknowledgement by Rose of what I'm talking about, which is that for all that he did and for all that Rose got right, and it was really quite audacious and brilliant and unique, if it isn't for people like Sam Hogan, that's a nice set of orders. But this is, I think, Rose acknowledging where the credit is at least as much due. Again, there happened to be a signal officer, a single corps member there, so there's a whole series of photos. These are publicly available of Hogan's task force when it comes back. You can see just what these guys have been through. It's pretty remarkable. So again, I think a nice way to end it, two ways quickly to end it. These are some photos from the 3rd Armored Division archive, and again, I think they're nice just to, again, remind you of what the conditions were that these men were fighting under, and just how brutal this cold was. I've been to the Ardennes, and I guess it was mid-March, and it was plenty cold enough and actually snowing. So these were staggeringly difficult conditions. So when you think back to Sam Hogan conducting a marching retreat, fighting retreat, these are the conditions that he's doing that in. John Smith, Rose's chief of staff, speaking shortly after the war at a memorial for Rose, said this about their fighting in those opening days from the 20th to 25th of the Bulge. John Smith said, "It was the bitterest fighting of the entire war for the 3rd Armored Division. The small force we had was able to seal off the northern hinge of the Bulge and prevented the advance north of some of their best panzer divisions. Without attempting to take one bit of glory away from those valiant heroes of Bastogne, our men rightfully feel that the 3rd Armored played an equally valiant part in holding the northern side of the Bulge against overwhelming odds." And I think that's a nice way of putting it. Shows you also, by the way, he's talking in 1945, the degree to which Bastogne has become sort of the media focus, even at that point in history of the battle. One more photo, again, gives you just a sense of the conditions that they're operating under. So again, I think in any time you're looking at the Battle of the Bulge, any aspect of it, it's very easy to look at these kind of maps and kind of get caught up in that and look at it from Eisenhower's perspective or Patton's perspective, which is important, but look down at the level of the Sam Hogans as well, because in a sense, I think that's very much, even with, again, the best of commanders like Rose making the most audacious and smartest decisions they can, it still comes down to these guys. So with that, I'll finish up my comments and love to take questions.
How did you go from enlisted man to officer?
In World War I, the Army started a program called officer training camps. And you've heard the term 90-day wonders that talking about in later wars like Vietnam. Well, these are the first 90-day wonders. You have to test into them, and it's sort of part of there's a progressive, and I don't mean politically progressive, I mean progressive as in the progressive era movement faction within the World War I Army that wants to try to professionalize becoming an officer. So they create these officer training camps. You have to test into them. And the most promising people on the standardized tests then get admitted to the program, 90 days of training, and they come out commissioned as a 2nd lieutenant. He's then promoted to 1st lieutenant before the end of the war and ends up promoted to captain in 1919. But it's really by virtue of this program, which then the Army immediately is downsized and retrenches and does away with the program once the war is over. So it's really, he's a high school dropout. He's lied about his age. So he doesn't have a college degree, which you're supposed to have to even apply for this program. So again, he says he's a student on the card is in the archives. He says he's a student. He has been with the National Guard, but he was 15 and had run away from home to join them, but says I was a non-commissioned officer with the National Guard, and says he's 22, scores the top of the test, gets in, gets commissioned. So he's a 17-year-old 1st lieutenant by the end of the war, who's even in his records at the end of the war, at the end of World War II, when he's killed, the Army has his birthday still wrong. So he got away with it the whole time.
What was Task Force Or? They did it right next to Hogan, but you didn't mention.
Yeah, I mean, I credit where credit is due, and I didn't have time to give them all. So you have Task Force Kane, Task Force Hogan, Task Force Tucker.
Right below Tucker's Or.
Yeah, and that's the reserve unit. So, in fact, effectively, he has a reserve up here, which is Or, and that gets fed into the battle, in effect, piecemeal. It's part of this sort of chess match that he's playing, where he's taking pieces of his quote-unquote reserve and feeding them in different places. So again, it's really impossible on a map to summarize all that, but yeah, he's part of the.
The prior speaker was talking about the 28th refit after the Hurricane Forest. The 116th Panzer Grenadiers was also in Hurricane Forest. Is there any evaluations at all of what strength level these units were up to? Because they were faced with the same thing. They came out of heavy fighting and now they're put right back in.
Right.
Do you think they were better prepared to refit it than our troops were?
I think, I mean, you have to obviously look at what specific force you're talking about. There was certainly a very concerted effort to particularly re-equip the panzer divisions before the battle, and you raise a great point kind of overall with the Hurtgen. I mean, it's a clear strategic error by the Germans, even though it's really a military success for the Germans. They chew up a couple of our divisions. It's probably our worst hour in terms of generalship is in the Hurtgen in a lot of ways. But you're right that it diverts strength from the attack, and so I don't know the exact detail. I know there's a concerted effort to refit them. The third is also licking its wounds. It's breached the Siegfried Wall. There's a little historic controversy. The third says, and actually all the articles from the Times say the third was the first to breach the Siegfried Wall. Eisenhower gives the honor to the 30th after the war. I'm not really sure, honestly. It makes not much difference who was there, an hour or two before the other. But they had been banging up against the Siegfried Wall for a period of months. So they were back here with 7 Corps, also licking their wounds and supposedly resting up when the Bulge breaks out.
Would you be able to shed any light on General Patton's Third Army and their role into January in the tank destroyer battalions and what they did?
Well, the question is on Patton and the Third Army's role, and short answer is that's definitely not an area that I claim great expertise on. Obviously, and again, Bastogne becomes very important, and that makes what Patton does and the speed at which he does it very important. But in a sense, you would say Bastogne shouldn't have been important. Hitler chooses to make it important. The smart strategic play is simply bypass it. But Hitler insists on pouring troops into it. So in effect, it does become critical, not because it, in a sense, should have been, but because Hitler makes it so. And that, in a way, that's what ties into the 101st and everything else that happens there. They're able to buy enough time for Patton to get there, and you've got a real core of German troops, not pinned down because they're surrounding the American troops, but they're ready to be hit with a flank attack.
What were the casualties suffered by these 3 task forces?
It varied by the task force. They were. I don't remember the exact numbers, down to the, but short version is they were high. Yeah. Hogan. Yeah, I mean, it's really, I don't understand to this day how he got out all of his men except for one. Must have been a hell of a commander. But by and large, my sense is, call it 50% casualties, plus or minus. Other places, 100. Again, there was a few other maps I was going to try to bring just to give you a sense for how confusing the battle became and how much the pieces are moving around in here. So it's almost, you have to drill down to this particular crossroads or that particular crossroads. You're just going to know one overall answer.
Are there any biographies written about Rhodes?
There are 2 biographies. One tries to sort of do a broader overview of his life, and I didn't have time to really get into this today. He's a very culturally important figure in the war. What I didn't have time to really detail is he's a complete outsider to the Army Officer Corps in World War I and in the interwar period. He's high school dropout. Right? So he's not he's not only not West Point, he doesn't have a college degree. He's an enlisted man. That goes to your question, very good one about how does an enlisted man even end up an officer. He's from a working class background when the old Army, the regular Army, is almost all upper middle class or upper class. He's the children of immigrants, Eastern European immigrants, and the Army is old stock. You're supposed, it's old Anglo-Saxon, Protestant lineage, and he's actually Jewish. He's the son and grandson of rabbis. So in order, and given the anti-Semitism of the interwar Army, he declares his official religion to the Army as Protestant. And it's not clear if he actually had a sincere conversion, whether he was doing it to advance his career, but either way, it was a requirement, effectively, if he was going to advance and succeed in the interwar Army. So there is a biography of him. The last names of the two authors are Sad and Marsh that tries to cover all this. There's another one. I think I have a slide here. This one is more on Rose with the 3rd Armored Division and a kind of pure military history. So it does cover, in part, the Battle of the Bulge. And again, I think it's a decent overview. It misses, I think, putting all the pieces together of his life. So I guess you're just going to have to wait for my thesis to read that to really.
Back to your map for a second. How important was the stand of Parker's Crossroads, the Practical Frontier, in giving time to Rose to organize his own?
Yeah, Rose said that. I'll go back to that just for. So that's this here. Yeah. Rose said after the battle that he felt that this was the critical holding point by his forces, and he's joined by. He is able to pull in some forces from some other divisions, pieces here and there. I mean, what's remarkable is even while he's fighting the battle, the Army is peeling portions of what's left of his division off in mid-battle and sending them, in a sense, hither and yon to deal with a gap here, a gap there. So the fluidity of what's going on is really hard to convey. But this does become critical, and it's, again, it's because it's a crossroads. It's a north-south and an east-west crossroads.
You and I have a neighbor who just died who was integral in that battle, John Schaffner, lived on Cuba Road.
Anyone else? Well, appreciate everyone's time. Great to see everyone. Thank you. Thank you. You're welcome.